Merry meet. What is your relationship with your inner child? And in what form does your inner child manifest? If you've never thought about the answers to questions like that, or you aren't working with your inner child right now, or at least from time to time, you're likely missing an important part of your shadow work journey. When we befriend the inner child and we develop a powerful relationship with them, they become a powerful aid on our path. Healing the inner child is also a way to remove emotional and energetic blockages that we might be holding in the body that can help us step further into our gifts and really celebrate who we are. So, Merry Meet, I'm Aislin. Welcome to the first episode of the new year. Happy 2024, everyone. To those who are joining us, saying hi now. So I'm here tonight. I'm here to talk all about shadow work and especially shadow work for the inner child. I see Melinda in the chat. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to dive right in. But if you are here live, feel free to put questions and comments in the chat. I'll be going back and forth with the chat throughout, and there will also be a Q&A at the end. And if you like any part of the video, make sure to leave a heart or a thumbs up somewhere. It just helps us get this out into the feed of more people. All right, so what is the inner child? So we're just going to start off by talking a little bit about what the inner child is, and we'll talk about the different ways that the inner child can manifest, and then I'll leave you with some ideas of how you can connect to the inner child on your shadow work journey. And just see a few more people in the chat now. I see Pamela's here and Cindy. Hi, everybody. All right, so diving in. The inner child is a connection that we have to the child self and to our childhood memories. So this is essentially your original self. So for those who are on the shadow work journey, you know that there are aspects of us that we have broken off unconsciously throughout our development. Those are parts of us that we feel for one reason or another they are not accepted by those around us or perhaps accepted by society. But the inner child was there before any of that began. The inner child witnessed all of that happening too, and we'll talk more about that later. That's why the inner child is such a powerful ally for us in our shadow work. But this is the aspect of us before any of that began, and so some might even say this is a truer form of ourselves than even we are today. Now, the inner child can help us gain insight into those shadow aspects that we've broken off. And for adults, and as adults, when we heal the inner child wounds, we will actually be one step closer to our own wholeness. So that's why this kind of work is so important. It's really not something to brush off. And unfortunately, society seems to force us to repress many of these aspects about ourselves and forces us to grow up. And the reality is that we must grow up. We can't live our lives as a child, into our adult years. But we also need to retain that aspect of magic and that aspect of innocence that we had and impurity when we were a child. And so we'll talk more about that tonight as well. But one thing for you to just think about as we, continue on in tonight's episode is what kind of a relationship do you have with your inner child? Do you feel that you are someone who's been able to retain a part of that childlike wonder in your life? Are you somebody who was really forced to grow up? I look at my own parents, for example, and there isn't a lot of childlike in them at all. For example, I grew up in kind of the video game era. Even as an adult in my 40s, I still play video games. I love them. In fact, my break, which I'm on kind of vacation right now, and when my goal was to spend a day just playing video games. So kind of thinking about that, where are you in your relationship with your inner child as we proceed and we start to talk about some of the other child archetypes? And just saying hi to a few more in the chat. I see Kurt is here and Nancy. Hi, everybody. Nancy, I haven't seen you in a while. Okay, so the deal is though, so when society kind of forces us to repress those aspects of ourselves and just kind of move on and grow up, what we do is we create issues that we must deal with at some point. So whether we're going to deal with those issues here in this incarnation or we'll deal with them in between incarnations, we've got to deal with them somewhere. Unresolved issues will, no matter what happens, show up later in our adult life. Now, most people have experienced various levels of trauma or traumatic events in their lives, and even those who didn't have what might be deemed a traumatic childhood probably know that there were moments in their lives when they didn't really get what they needed. So, um, I'll tell you more about my own kind of story as we go, because I think hearing other people's experiences of the inner child kind of helps us relate to our own. But for me, if you look back on my childhood, there's no major traumatic events. I wasn't physically abused or emotionally abused or anything like that. But I did develop an eating disorder at a very early age. And so whenever that happens, we got to kind of look at what's going on, right, in the system that's going to create something like that. And so as I've been able to kind of piece my own healing journey back together for myself, one of the things that I've realized is there were needs that were unmet. I was a very emotional child that was brought up in a family that didn't really express emotions. And that right there is going to create conflict that is going to wound the child in some way. So kind of think about your own story. Both of these wounds are relevant, whether it actually is physical or emotional or sexual abuse that the person experienced, but also that experience of just not really having what you need at various aspects of your childhood. Saying hi to a few more joining us. Hi, Leslie. Now, the inner child can help us explore and uncover those areas for growth. For example, and I think that this is a powerful story that I just wanted to share a little bit about something that someone told me. So there was someone who had written to me in the group who said that they were kind of working through some long-term issues that they had in their relationship with their wife. And through shadow work, this member was able to kind of trace that all the way back to issues that he had with his father, in particular, a specific incident that had happened. And because of this insight that he had, and tracing it all the way back and kind of working, doing that little inner child work, he was able to make a major life change that he'd not been able to make for a long time or forever up until that point. And that realization of like this connection to his father and how that all his relationship issues were stemming all the way back from that point was enough to allow him to kind of free himself of that burden, make that major life change, and his relationship improved immediately overnight. So this can be some very powerful work, but I do want to preface it always with, and shadow work should always be prefaced with this. It's not fast work. So sometimes we'll come to it, and some of you may, just from what you hear today, may have some major aha moments, and others may kind of mull over it, and it may take time for some of this to settle in and resonate. But you will have profound changes when you start to explore your inner child, especially these different archetypes we're going to talk about. Hi, Jenny, and Tony's here too. Mary, meet everybody. Okay, so let's talk about the types of inner child. So I think one of the best places for people to start is to explore how your inner child manifests. So now most sources agree that there are about 6 main inner child archetypes. There's a bunch of sub archetypes as well. So if you have heard of one before that's not on this list of 6, it likely falls into a subcategory of one of these. Now, these 6 main child archetypes, you may find that you resonate with all 6 of them, but what we're really hoping to find for our shadow work is 1 or 2 of them that are more dominant. And then those 1 or 2 give you a pathway, they give you a direction for your work. So as I start going through these 6 archetypes, kind of listen to it and see if any of these resonate with you. You can even take some notes if you want. In our Shadow Seekers membership, we go into this in much greater detail. So if you find that you are really interested in this afterwards, you might consider joining our membership. But I'm going to share with you enough tonight that you could get started on this work on your own, okay? So the wounded child is the first one we're going to start with, and I would say that the majority of people will probably resonate with this one in some way. Now, the wounded child suffered some kind of early abuse, neglect, or trauma. And remember what I said before, trauma doesn't have to be what we think of as classical trauma, physical abuse in the home or anything like that. It can be anything that you consider traumatic. Um, so the inner child, the wounded inner child, feels that their traumatic childhood uh, and the events of that wounded childhood have substantial impact on their adult life. And so many trauma survivors will likely resonate with this archetype and will probably consider this to be their dominant one. Now, the trauma, as I said, doesn't have to be physical. It can be anything that we experienced as being traumatic. And many healers will also usually resonate with this archetype. So, for example, many healers actually come to the path to heal others because they're searching for a way to heal themselves. This goes all the way back to Chiron, the wounded healer, that archetype of we do our own healing, and through finding ways to heal ourselves, we become better at healing other people. And I always say, as an aside, when I was in my master's degree in counseling psychology, you know, they actually make everyone have a counselor, have a therapist while you're in the program, because the idea is you want to heal yourself as you're going through the work. But what I also noticed is many of the people who are in the program with me, as we got to know each other over those couple of years that we were intimately connected to each other in the program, stories would come out of their own kind of trauma and healing that they were trying to work through as they were becoming, training to become healers themselves. Now, on the light side of the wounded child, there's this great capacity to heal. The wounded child has the ability to forgive. The wounded child has empathy beyond anything that, most people know. But the shadow side of the wounded child is that there's this ability to drown in our own self-pity, to blame caregivers or problems. So if we feel ourselves saying things like, my mom is the reason for all of my problems, while it is very likely to be true that the person who says that their mother is a major source of their issues, when we're working with the inner child, and especially when we're working with our shadow work, we're trying to separate ourselves from those external things, right? So that's where we would see, if we start to say things like that, we start to blame others for the things that are going on in our lives, we kind of know that we're falling into that shadow aspect of the archetype, right? And that kind of helps us bring ourselves back to center. So that is the wounded child. And so, like I said, many people, I start off with that one because many people are going to relate to it. Um, and I see Cindy was saying here, she wasn't abused and she appreciates her upbringing. Her parents love her. Her dad is a minister, as is her brother. She says she loves him both. I've always been the dreamer and love always have been drawn to nature. You're going to resonate with one that we're about to talk about here. Yes, very much. You're going to resonate with probably with the magical child that we're about to talk. We're about to talk about. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the orphan child. So many people are going to resonate with the wounded child, and some may also resonate with this orphan child. Now, the orphan child likely also experienced trauma. So sometimes you'll find that you're going to resonate with both of these. A wounded child will often consider themselves an orphan child as well. Now, the orphan child has this lifelong, or at least the childhood pattern of feeling like they didn't fit in and didn't belong with the family. And so, what this means is this is not necessarily someone who was orphaned. So, if a person was orphaned, lost their parents at an early age, was brought up by someone else other than their parents, they're likely going to resonate with this. But you could be with your nuclear family during your entire upbringing and still resonate with this one as well. For example, this is the one that I consider the most dominant one for me. I'll tell you a little bit about why once we get through this definition. Um, so for people who end up choosing the orphan child as their dominant inner child archetype, usually their painful childhood memories revolve around not being accepted or not fitting in, never really fitting in. And there may be this terrible fear of abandonment, right? There may be a searching for or fantasies about a surrogate family. So, for example, like I mentioned in the beginning, there's no physical trauma in the house, very good family. I had a good family. I was provided with certain things that I needed, but what I was lacking was someone to help me deal with how emotional I was. And growing up in a family where literally everyone around you doesn't show any emotions or doesn't seem to have any, was very disconcerting. And so I had fantasies of having been switched at birth or not, being from a different family. I remember having fantasies growing up of like being on a show and finding my family. And so that's a very powerful connection to the orphan child, even for a family, even for a child who grew up with their nuclear family. So that is the orphan child. And so you kind of consider how you fit into your family, and that will help you see if you connect to this one or not. Now, the magical child is the one, this one and the next one I think that Cindy is really going to relate to, and probably many in this group as well. The magical child is someone who, no matter what, always saw sacredness and beauty in life around them from a very early age. And so I think that the epitome of this, to really help us hammer in like what the magical child looks like, is Anne Frank. So if you've read her story, you know that the tragic story that she underwent, but yet there was always this ability to see the humanity in all of life, even when all these tragedies were happening around her. So that viewpoint stays with the magical child even when there are dark things around them. Now, this must really be the primary way that this person relates to life, and usually the magical child will also have this viewpoint as they transition into adulthood. So if you think that you connect to this archetype, kind of think about what is your viewpoint right now. So are you a very positive and optimistic person? Then you might fit into this magical child archetype. Um, Now, the magical child may find that they were deemed foolish by others around them, like cynical adults who kind of try to take some of that magic away. And what that also means is that the magical child, kind of in the shadow side of it, can retreat too far into fantasy, and too far into kind of like disengaging from reality. So that's something that someone who connects to that archetype always has to consider. Now, let me skip to, I'll go with the nature child next, since it actually connects very much to this one. So the nature child has a deep, intimate connection to nature, as the title would suggest, right? Usually there's an affinity and a friendship with animals from a very, very early age, but I do want to say, because most of the people who follow me and are in my groups love animals. And so it goes beyond just a love of animals. So there's usually a rapport with nature spirits, even from a very early age, which is why we have some connections to that magical child as well. And a lifelong pattern of really needing to connect with animals or to bond with animals for their own well being. So, this is someone who really can't live without having animals around them. So you may connect to that one as well if you connect to the magical child. So sometimes people will have more than one that they connect to. The divine child is also kind of similar to the magical child, but has a redemptive mission. So the divine child tends to be very positive, very optimistic, but there's also this really, really deep connection to God. So, whatever God means to the child, whether it's like a Christian God or the gods, if that child was raised in a pagan household, there's some kind of a unique relationship with God or the gods and a desire to serve God or divinity. May also have God-like characteristics themselves. So, like if we look at any of the stories of the major prophets growing up, we're going to see the divine child there. Especially if anybody has read Siddhartha, for example, that would be a good example of the divine child. And then, so some people may connect to that one, especially those who knew from an early age that they wanted to go into the clergy. So, for example, for me, I grew up Christian, and even as a little kid, I mean, I had several dream jobs that I wanted. I always wanted to be a singer, but I really did want to be a minister. There was something that was really attractive about that. And I had a very, very, very deep connection to God, even from when I was a little kid. So I definitely resonate with the divine child archetype. And so it makes sense that I would go on to become a high priestess, lead a coven, right? Be helping facilitate groups like this. So you can kind of look at your connection, not just where you are right now, but also did you have those connections when you were a child, and that will help you determine if the divine child is one that you resonate with. And then finally, the sixth one is the eternal child. Now, the eternal child is really determined to stay young. So in the shadow side of it, we might even look at like a character like Michael Jackson, right? That desire to kind of always be staying young. But there's also very light sides to this archetype as well, because as you remember, I mentioned in the beginning, is that we can't just become adults and push our child side away. We need that childlike wonder and innocence and purity also in our adult lives. So the anyone who relates with the eternal child likely needs a lot of unstructured time. They don't tend to do really well when there's a lot of deadlines and structured time. So even as adult, they kind of need that time to just go off script, right, and do whatever. Be carefree and innocent. Um, they may also resist kind of the boundaries that are sort of expected of conventional childhood. But in the shadow side of this, it may manifest as extreme dependence on someone else. So, extreme dependence on a spouse or a partner or financial provider. So, I know someone who's in her, I guess she's probably close to 60, but never really worked, had a father who had a lot of money. He never really needed her to work. And so I think she definitely falls into that shadow side of this because she's just so reliant on him for everything and can't really do anything herself. So that is the eternal child, and that is the fear that we have with the eternal child. Like we all kind of want some of that, right? We would love actually to be able to have, well, probably we'll also notice that all six of these play out in our lives in some ways, right? But where we want to watch is do they play out in the light side or do they play out in the shadow side? So once you have kind of listened to all this, so what do we do with this? So the next step is to choose your dominant child, and yours is like I said, you're likely to relate to more than one of these. Now that's okay. So you want to kind of start exploring your connections, and eventually you will narrow this down to one or two that you really relate to. And if you're having trouble choosing between two, so like I relate to a lot of them. I relate to the nature child, I relate to the divine child, as I said, and I definitely relate to the orphan child. Okay, so if I have three of these, what I want to do is I want to try to narrow this down to where do I think my more of my shadow work lies. Okay, do I think more of it lies with the divine child and the nature child, or I think it probably more of it lies with the orphan child? And so that can also help you determine which is kind of the dominant one that you would want to do your shadow work with. So many people are going to relate to both, like I said, many of these. Many will relate to the wounded and the orphan child. And so you just need to find for yourself. Everybody's going to have kind of a different answer they're going to come to when they ask this question. But which one do you think right now the majority of your shadow work stems from? And that will help you choose. Where do you think the bulk of your issues come from? So for a person who is kind of trying to choose between the orphan and the wounded child, I would ask them, do you think the bulk of your issues come from your trauma, or do you think they come from your abandonment, right? And so whatever that person answers, that sort of gives them the pathway to focus more on that archetype. Okay, so now once you have identified that archetype, now you have a path for some shadow work, right? So you can try activities to help your inner child engage. And so here's the thing. So before I get into the activities, one of the things that you may notice is that once you identify this archetype, you may do nothing else and you'll start to get some answers. Okay. So once you kind of determine, okay, I am an orphan child, or I resonate with that orphan child archetype, your unconscious mind, you've like, it's like basically you sent your unconscious mind a message that I get it. I actually see the pattern that's been going on here. And this, it's almost like it gives the unconscious like a permission to begin to engage with you. And so you may find, like that person I told you about in the beginning, where he just started doing some shadow work and some work with the inner child, and was able to make that connection to something that went back all the way to an event with his dad, that then was able to clear out some stuff in his current relationship that he'd struggled with for quite some many years. So you may find, just as you start to make this connection, you'll start to see these patterns. You'll start to notice, like, some of my issues stem all the way back to that moment when this happened to me. That I was at that event and no one would talk to me. And all of a sudden these aha moments will come. So that may be, that's like, to me, that would be kind of a passive way for the shadow work to work, but it absolutely does happen that way. Now, if we want to be active, though, if we don't want to wait for kind of that, just the work to come through on its own, you can start to engage in some of these activities. So the first one is non-dominant hand dialogue. And so for those who are in Shadow Seekers, we have a ritual where we actually did this. And for those of you who aren't in Shadow Seekers, I'll explain how to do it on your own. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to get some paper, and I recommend getting pens and markers and crayons and whatever you want, paint, and you are going to have a dialogue with your inner child using both of your hands. And so what you do is you start with your dominant hand, which is the one that you normally write with, and you're going to write something on a piece of paper to your inner child. And so usually you want to start with something like "you are," and say something to them that perhaps you needed to hear when you were a child. Okay, so if you were somebody who didn't feel accepted, you're going to write, "You are loved and accepted." And then you're going to pick up something with the non-dominant hand, so the one you don't normally write with, and you're going to just let it do something. So sometimes it'll just write back, "thank you," or it'll draw something or paint something. And you really want to be, before you do this, you really do want to try to get into a really relaxed state, because if you think that the exercise won't work, it's not going to work. And if you're pretty stressed out and you're not able to relax, it probably won't work either. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of break through the barrier of the unconscious and get the inner child to talk to us in some kind of way. So once you're sure that you're relaxed, then you'll just continue this kind of back and forth. And so then you'll go back to the dominant hand and you'll answer. And then you'll go back to the non-dominant hand and you'll let the inner child answer. And you go back and forth. I usually set a timer for 5 minutes. And what I tell people is that sometimes nothing comes of it. It's just gibberish, scribbling, nothing. You feel like you can't do anything. If nothing is coming at all, it generally means that you're not relaxed. You've got some kind of walls built up that isn't allowing you to engage with the exercise. And then I would try to get more relaxed and come back to it at a later time. But it's okay too if the first round is just gibberish. Who knows? But sometimes people will find that really important things come through. There may be pages of kind of like nothing, and then there's that one gem that means something to you. So I recommend trying that exercise out if you've never done it. And like I said, if you're in Shadow Seekers, you can go to the April ritual with Corey, meeting the inner child, or I think healing the inner child is what it's called. And I lead you through the entire exercise there. So another thing that you can do is create some kind of artistic rendition of the inner child. Now, you don't have to be really artistic to do this. I'm not. You can do this anyway. You can even do it like through AI software, but just try to create an artistic rendition of your inner child and put that in a notebook or put that on your altar, or in any place where you're going to be when you're working with your inner child. You can paint, you can color, you can use glitter, whatever. Go to Michael's and just knock yourself out, right? To get some fun stuff and just really make a fun experience of this. And that goes for any kind of art. Like coloring is great for the inner child. Like those little art kits that they sell at Michael's. And so that leads me to the inner child date. And so one inner child date is to go to Michael's and get yourself something fun to make, especially if there was something like that you weren't allowed to make when you were a little kid. Like you weren't allowed to use something like markers, permanent markers, or glitter or whatever. Go and get that and make it now. So the inner child date, that's one way that you can do an inner child date. But the inner child date is essentially you exploring things that your inner child likes. So if there was a food that you loved as a little kid and you just haven't had it since you were an adult, or you won't let yourself have it, go let yourself have it for 10 minutes, right? Or if there's a place that you love to go, or a place that you wanted to go, always wanted to go, but couldn't go, weren't allowed to go, take your child there. Buy your child a toy. Take yourself to the arcade. You really, I mean, the sky is really the limit here. The idea here is to spend quality time with your inner child. I see somebody, Karen is saying she's losing connection. I hope it's on her end and not on mine. I hope that people who are here can still hear this. But so that is the inner child date, and just really let yourself go. Really let your imagination go. And don't think about being an adult. Don't think about that it's beneath you or you shouldn't do it because it's for little kids. Just do whatever you're called to for the inner child date. So another thing that you can do is write a letter to your inner child. So the things that you wish that somebody could have said to you, you can write those in a letter to your inner child, and you could put it in your journal to keep it to read later. You can burn it, kind of send it off into the universe like the act has been done, right? Um, and then other ways to connect with the inner child, like I said, doing things that the inner child likes, eating foods, drinks that the inner child likes, playing games, playing with toys. You don't have to have kids or grandkids in order to play with toys. And in fact, here is like one of my favorite gifts I got. My boyfriend got me the Gengar Squishmallow. And my parents didn't quite understand what this was about when we unwrapped on Christmas morning. But for me, it is like one of the best gifts that I could have received, because I love Gengar, I love Pokemon, and it just really delighted my inner child to have this. And then another thing that you can do is just have unstructured time. So if you're somebody who's especially very rudimented with a schedule, make sure that you have some time where you have nothing to do and you just let your inner child sort of decide what the two of you will do. And then another thing you can do is look at pictures of you as a child, because that can also stimulate connections to the inner child, stimulate memories, especially when you're engaged in this work and you start to do things like that. You may find, like that person I told you about in the beginning, all of a sudden you have kind of that aha moment and that connection back to something that happened as a child, right? And that can be very liberating and very freeing when that happens. All right, so I am going to stop there. I hope there's still connection. I see that Cindy was saying she sings "Behold, there is magic" every day, and that really helps. Yeah, that's another thing that's very good for connecting to the inner child, is singing. Anything that really allows us to just let go can be so good for the soul and so good for the inner child. Okay, so I am going to open it up for the Q&A. All right, so if you're here live, put anything in the chat. You can go ahead and put things in the chat. And I see that Melinda says she can hear me. Great, very good. Okay, so putting things in the chat if you'd like. I have a few questions that people sent to me, so I'm going to start with those, but the floor is open. And anything you put in, It doesn't have to be about inner child or shadow work. It could be anything you want to ask about witchcraft, energy work, shadow work, etc. Okay, I'm going to start with a question that was sent by Kimberly, and she was asking about spirit animals. So this is a good question. This is one that a lot of people wonder about. I get asked this question a lot. So there are a variety of ways. So she basically said, how could someone tell what their spirit animal was? So there are a variety of ways that you can tell what your spirit animal is. So one of them is just a natural affinity that you have. So if there is a animal that you just simply have always had a natural affinity for, or maybe even you suddenly have a natural affinity for it, that is likely to be a sign from the universe that this particular animal or spirit animal wants to work with you. Um, Another way that people find spirit animals is through characteristics that they themselves want to embody. So if you're somebody who wants to bolster your strength, right, or your solar plexus, your self-belief, kind of working with the spirit animal of a lion or some of the big cats, right? That would be really good for somebody who's trying to foster self-belief. So oftentimes you can find spirit animals just simply through intentions that you have. Um, so for me, one of them that when I started my fertility journey, one animal that showed up a lot for me was the rabbit, and the rabbit is a sign of fertility. It's a sign of springtime, right, and newness and new beginnings, and um, and so that leads us to signs and synchronicities. So sometimes when there's a spirit animal that's trying to connect to us, we will notice signs and synchronicities in the world around us. And it doesn't just have to be that physical animal showing up. So it could be like for me, like I would see the rabbits all the time when I was out hiking. But it could also be seeing pictures of rabbits places or hearing songs so sometimes we get very narrow and fixated on what we think signs and synchronicities can look like, but we really expand out, we'll notice that we're missing some. So just kind of be open and aware. If you seem to be seeing messages from that same animal in all different kinds of places, it's a good chance that that's an animal that's trying to connect to you. Typically, when we talk about spirit animals, those tend to be guides. They're here to give us messages, give us insight, help us take ourselves from where we are on the path right now to where we would like to be. So anytime that you notice animals showing up in your dreams, for example, that would be another way that a spirit animal could show up. Um, so that would be what would be my suggestion on how a person could find a spirit animal. So if you feel like you're kind of open to one, I mean, that would be the first thing I would say too, is make sure that you're like open to receiving one. And if you don't feel like anything's really coming through, think about an intention that you have and then search for animals that are connected to that intention. Then you can actually begin working with the spirit animal that way as well. Okay, so I hope that helps. The next question, I already answered this question. Cindy had asked a question, and I answered it in the group. But I really love the question, so I wanted to bring it here tonight in the episode as well. So she said that she had a dream about a male figure who had a horn and a beard, horns and a beard, and the message was, "Cindy, you are safe." And she was just kind of wondering about who this figure could be, and she wanted to be able to connect to him again. So I said, I think that this sounds to me like the horned god. Cindy had already had a connection to a goddess previously as well. And so here, to me, it sounds like the god is making himself known to her too. So I had suggested that she look at Cernunnos, Faunus, Pan, Hern. These are just a few of the manifestations that the horned god archetype presents himself as, and see if any of those connect. Generally, the horned god is the masculine divine energy. It's energy of fertility. He's the consort of the earth mother. But it could also be is like if when somebody is really focused kind of on a goddess, or they're kind of in that more divine feminine path, sometimes the male side, the masculine side of the energy will make itself known too, which to suggest that you need balance too. So that's another reason like the two may, or one may show up when you've been working mostly with the other. But I thought it was a really great question. And just in general, when you have kind of dreams like this, ones that kind of stick with you, it generally means that there's some kind of an important message coming through. So always worth exploring what it could mean. And then she also had said she was hoping to connect to him again. And so what I suggest doing, I think he will. I mean, once kind of a god or a goddess or kind of divine energy makes itself known to you, generally it will come back, because it wants to explore a relationship with you, especially if you're receptive to it. But I would even set intentions before bedtime, that I would like to connect to this energy again. I would like to connect to whoever you feel that it was again. And sometimes what you'll find is that nothing happens, right, for a couple of nights, maybe a couple of weeks, but if you keep setting that intention, eventually the messages will come through. And the other thing too is if you kind of were able to figure out which of these deities it was that was connecting to you, then you can begin to leave offerings for him. And as you start to create your relationship with him, you're going to notice that he's going to show up in your life more and more. Also, I did want to mention that a great time of the year as we move into spring and summer to work with a deity like this, especially as we start to move out of the winter months. All right, and then I have another question here. Oh yes, Cindy says she hopes that he continues to reach. She says she'll continue to reach out, and she hopes he reaches out again. I'm pretty sure he will. And then Tony said he follows the horn god in Hecate. Yeah. So some people will follow the horn god, just call him the horned god. Others will kind of work with these other manifestations, more specific manifestations of it. But it is a deity, especially like people who consider themselves Wiccan. You don't have to be Wiccan to work with both sides of deity, but many people who are Wiccan will find that they connect to both. So they'll have a patron god and a patron goddess, like Tony was saying. Um, Okay, so Tabitha asked a question about astrological charts, and she said, how does being on the cusp affect an astrological chart? She said her husband's birthday is February 19th, which she's seen classified as both an Aquarius and a Pisces, with Pisces being most predominant. Okay, so a bit about cusps. So for anybody who doesn't know what a cusp is, the cusp is when a person's birth date falls between two different signs. Typically, this is when we're talking about a cusp, we're talking about the sun sign. So she's correct. The birth date of February 19th usually is going to fall, most charts are going to say, or most sources that you look at are going to say that that's Pisces. In fact, even some will say that the 18th is the beginning of Pisces, which would make the 19th safely inside a Pisces. Um, but what I would recommend people think about who are on the cusp is look at the energies on both sides, and that will help you determine which one you fit with most. Usually, well, I shouldn't even say usually, the signs that are next to each other, consecutive signs, are fairly different, right? So if you look at like Aries and you look at Taurus, those are two energies that are quite different. And so you may be able to see, does your husband or whoever's on the cusp, does that person fit more into Pisces, or does that person fit more into Aquarius? But what you may also notice, people who are on the cusp may also notice, is that changes during different parts of their lives, or depending on what kind of energy is going on in their lives, one or the other of the signs will feel more dominant. But the other thing that I would mention is that there are other parts of the chart as well that lend so much to us. The sun sign is just this one small little part of the chart. So usually when we get kind of fixated on, which side of the cusp am I on, what I would recommend people do is sort of look at the rest of their chart as well. And that can sort of explain some of these other aspects. So let me give you an example. I was born on March 26th. This is considered still within the cusp of Aries and Pisces, though it's a good 3 to 4 days into Aries, depending on which source you're looking at. As a kid, I always felt more like a Pisces. And in fact, I remember buying like a little Pisces necklace at Claire's when I was a little kid. Um, but as I grew up and I learned more about astrology, I found that actually I really do fit Aries very well. I think it's a good sun sign for me. But that really emotional thing and kind of intuitive thing that I was connecting to with the Pisces could be explained through my Cancer rising. My ascendant is in Cancer. So sometimes that will kind of help you too. Like usually what I would tell people, like, so somebody who's the 19th, I would say that person's probably going to resonate more with Pisces. But if they resonate more with Aquarius, maybe look at what else is going on in the chart and see if any of those kind of Aquarius qualities could be explained by something else. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. You can actually, if you're just reading horoscopes, you can read both Aquarius and Pisces for somebody like that who's on the cusp. But that would be my best answer. Is most of the time this particular date is going to be Pisces, but look at both energies and also notice when they shift and change throughout the lifetime. Okay. Okay, so Kurt said, would shadow work and the Akashic records have anything to do with one another? So I think that everything can always have connections, can always have something to do with each other. And I do agree. I mean, so shadow work, I feel like when we're doing our shadow work, we very much can open up the Akashic records to see what's there. It will give us insight into things that have happened in this life, things that have happened in previous lives as well. So I think they're very much connected to them. In our own membership, we we are planning to work with Akashic records at some point, but we also work with like archetypes and the soul contract, because I do think that things that we carry with us into this life and the things that are kind of written in the records are very relevant to the work that we're doing right now. And so sometimes what will happen is that when we start to reveal and open up some of that stuff, we see patterns that we weren't able to see without it. So I actually do think that Akashic records and shadow work can go hand in hand very much. It's a good question. Any other questions? Anybody who's here live, put some in the chat. While we're waiting to see if there's any other questions, let me just tell you what's coming up. So next week, the episode on 110. It's something to do with the dark moon. I haven't decided exactly what it is yet, but we will be on the dark moon, so I thought it would be a good time to do a dark moon episode again. And then on 117, I'm going to be doing an episode on meditation techniques for witches. So I did an episode similar to this about a year ago. It's a question I get asked a lot about, is meditation, how to hone our meditative techniques. So I'm going to teach you a whole slew of different techniques that you can use to kind of get into a meditative state, and especially some techniques for those of you who find meditating really hard. Hopefully you'll find one or more techniques in that episode that will help you, because sometimes we think that meditation is just sitting on a pillow and clearing the mind, and that is just one form of meditation. There are so many. And so usually when people say, I can't meditate, I usually say, you just haven't found the right kind of meditation yet for you. So that is going to be a great episode. That one's coming up on 117. All right, so I don't see any more comments here or questions. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off for tonight, but it was great seeing everybody and great having the first episode of the new year. So I hope that your transition into 2024 has been a good one. And just know too that like I mentioned, we do have a dark moon coming up next week on the 10th, and then the new moon on the 11th. And so the first new moon, dark moon pair of any year, any calendar year, is a powerful time for us to kind of clear out the old and bring in the new. So if you didn't really have time to do anything for the new year, that's okay. Really plan to do some work at this first dark moon though, and you can set intentions for the new year to come. All right, until next time, blessed be.